I'm sure it's him. Aren't you sure it's him? He's just too much fun. No, he fed me lasagna. His wife made lasagna. I got some of it yesterday. She made it for her two nephews are here, and she made it for her two nephews, but I got some of it. It was good. I've had lasagna all over the world. I mean, oh, wait a minute, I'm talking to the video. I've had lasagna all over the world. That's the best lasagna I've ever had. I've had lasagna in Germany, I've had it in Italy, I've had it in really strange places, Japan, Korea. Oh my God, that was the worst. The Koreans cannot cook. I'm sorry, they make everything.
You've been to Italy, right?
I've been to Italy, yeah.
You ever had like a full meal?
Oh,
It's
God.
like 8 courses.
No, how in the world did they
By the
stay?
fourth one, I'm like, I'm done.
Yeah, exactly. But then again, our problem is, as Americans, we're eating, when the food is good, we eat as much as we can. And so we're not ready for the next course. The Italians are smart. They just eat a couple bites and and they're finished. But, you know, we think we have to eat all the food because our mother told us to. Eat all your food so that you can grow up. Okay, so if you have a computer, you can look at chapter 2. I can't project it up here. I apologize. We're talking about the family system. The family system works because we're looking at the family dynamic, and the family dynamic is really quite important. If you think of your own family and your brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and grandmother and grandfather, there was always a dynamic going on between you and everybody else. Somebody was in charge, somebody ran the house, somebody did this, somebody did that. There's always stuff going on in the family, and this is part of the family dynamic. Now, I'm assuming everybody's family dynamic worked, that there was no tension going on between you and your siblings, like that for happens. If anybody ever has brothers and sisters, there's always fighting going on. I never fought with my younger brothers, but I always fought with my older brother. We would have fights. I mean, literally, we would punch each other, which was kind of stupid. I had fights with all my older siblings. I had 2 older sisters, and I used to fight with them all the time. But never my younger brothers, as strange as that may seem.
Are you the middle child?
I am the middle child, I am the troublemaker, I'm the joker.
I can relate.
Okay. Yeah, nobody causes trouble like I can cause trouble. Okay. I was my mother's least favorite child. Okay. So these all have to do with family dynamics. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about family systems. Family systems assist clients in identifying reciprocal relationships between their behavior and influences of the system within which they interact. And when we're talking about that, what we're talking about, of course, is the family dynamics and how people interact with each other. Yeah, cross in front of them. Good job. Clients realize that both how someone else's behavior is influencing them and how their behavior is influencing others. So if you're, and I was, when Sarah was here, Sarah was in charge, and she liked everything to happen the way she wanted it to happen, and I knew I couldn't change her, so one of the things that I did, I stopped trying. And when you stop trying, it's called passive-aggressive behavior, because I was kind of dragging my feet. Okay, and that's passive-aggressive behavior. And I knew I was doing that. And I told Sarah, you know, if you keep pushing me like this, I'm going to get more and more passive-aggressive. And of course, we're both psychologists, so we both knew exactly what I was talking about. And she said, you don't have to be passive-aggressive if you don't want to. I said, well, that's the only way I can function in this environment. That was the only way I could survive. Otherwise, I'd leave. You know, and that wouldn't have been good, especially. Otherwise, you guys would have one instructor, and he can only teach 3 classes. That'd work perfectly, wouldn't it?
Oh my God, if you leave too, then, you know, I'm leaving too.
Well, I mean, if I leave, there's no program, that's the
Yeah.
whole point. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so yeah, we had that kind of a relationship. But I told her flat out that, you know, she kept treating me this way. You know, I'd make a suggestion and she'd say, you know, no, what do you want? You know, that kind of a deal. I said, you know, I can't function under this type of pressure. You need to be a little bit more flexible. And then I will be able to give you, to be able to provide information that you need. Otherwise, I'll just be passive aggressive and I'll just drag my feet. And it'll get worse and worse and worse. And of course, she took it all to heart. She started changing things. One of the things I wanted to do, I wanted to increase the number of counseling classes. I thought we needed a stronger counseling program here. It seemed like the program she had wasn't very strong in counseling. And of course, eventually, after a couple of years, she agreed, and we started increasing the number of counseling classes. And now next semester, I'll be teaching a class of advanced counseling. This is the introductory counseling class, and that's an advanced counseling class. So there you go. We did it.
But if you're on that old degree checklist, we can't do that though, right?
It's a 300 level class. Oh, that's right. It's on the older degree. It doesn't exist on the old degree checklist. So what can we do? Well, we can substitute. We can substitute that class for another 300 level class. We can do that. Okay, but don't worry. All we have to do is convince Dr. Lerman to do that. Yes, sir.
Has there ever been any talk about creating a BA and then also a BS course in psychology? So one would have, like, one would be more research. Yeah, then the other one could be like a lot more counseling and direct application.
I don't think we really need to make it a BS. We can still make it a BA. The course that the program that she set up was very research oriented, and that's because
That's her background.
that's her background. And I argued about it, and we had knockdown, drag out fights over it. I wanted to change it to be less research oriented, and she wouldn't budge. And this is part of the, you know, passive aggressive thing. But the answer is, well, we'll have to see.
Well, it's interesting because she's new to she was relatively new to the field.
Right.
So it's not like she came from 20 years of background of counseling and working in the field. She was just right out of graduate
She's not a
school.
counselor. She tried to go into a counseling program, but she stopped. She couldn't handle it. It was too intense for her.
Is this thing recording?
I'm recording. She probably watches all my lectures to see if I say anything about it. Oh, no, she doesn't. No, she doesn't, does she? Oh, are you there, Sarah? Wait a minute, let me see who I'm shooting at. Let's move it over. There we go. We'll hit my face a little bit more. We'll show the beautiful pictures that they're showing. Anyway, yeah, we're going to change things. We've already changed the checklist so that all the 300 level classes, you just need a number of 300 level classes and you can choose. But of course, those of you who have been in the program for 3 years, you're on the old checklist and that doesn't make any difference. But I think I can talk Dr. Lerman into making exceptions. How's that? Okay. So we can substitute. Why do we have to be so absolutist? This is the way everything has to be done. Okay. I've been in other institutions where you can substitute classes, and I think that's what we need to do with the people on the old checklist. Okay. But there's a new checklist, so if you started this year, you're on the new checklist. So you're good to go. Okay. Well, we'll see what happens. I don't want to be the one that dictates what happens next, because I'll be retiring someday within the next couple of years. I would have retired this year if my wife had. She was trying to get me to retire. this year and not come back, but of course I couldn't do that. I had to come back. So we'll see what happens with whoever we get to replace Sarah and to replace Sue. I think it's important that we go with their strengths, right? I mean, I'm a counseling psychologist, Sue is a counseling psychologist, Sarah was a cognitive psychologist, whoever we get next, and Jeremiah is a counseling psychologist. So whoever we hire next, they need to put the program together because they're the ones that are going to be teaching it into perpetuity. And of course, I'm only going to be here for the next couple of years. It doesn't make any sense for me to change it so that it fits me if I'm going away, right? Okay. All right. Okay. We won't go into why we have a cognitive program. That has to do with Sarah. Anyway, it was very research oriented. So in the future, we may decrease the number of research classes that people have to take. The ecological perspective, oh, am I on the ecological perspective? I wanted to talk more about counseling, or about family dynamics. So one of the things about family dynamics is that as a counselor, what you have to do is you have to look at the family and you have to decide what the pathology is in the family, and you have to change it. Now the problem is we've got mom thinks we need family counseling, so she brings all of her babies in. You know, all those teenage babies, she brings them all in, and of course we get all this arguing going on back and forth. So we fix the family dynamics of all the people in the room, and guess who's really the main problem? It's the guy that's not there, it's Dad. Dad's the problem and he won't come to counseling. So have we fixed anything?
No.
No, we haven't fixed anything at all because Dad is the problem and Dad's not coming into counseling. Because he doesn't need counseling. But, of course, as far as family dynamics he needs to come in. We had this situation in my own family. I have a niece who's schizophrenic, or she's borderline, or she's got all kinds of interesting problems, or she's bipolar. They haven't decided what her problem is. She goes to one counselor and he diagnoses her with schizophrenia. We go to another counselor and they diagnose her as borderline, and another counselor diagnoses her as bipolar. I know. So she goes into a counselor and he says, you know, I think part of your problem is how you interact with your mother. So we need your mother to come into counseling. We need to have a family intervention. We need to have a family counseling session. So my brother says, fine, let's go. And the daughter says, okay, let's go in. And Mom says, no, I'm not going in. So if the problem is Mom, and Mom won't go into counseling, she just stays the same way she is. And she's been diagnosed with this disability, with this mental illness for 30 years. Is that right? Yeah. Not quite 30 years. 25 years. And her mom won't go into counseling. Why? Because her mother does have a mental illness, and she doesn't want it disclosed. As long as she doesn't go in, she doesn't find out about it, and she can pretend that she's normal. That's on tape. I wait till my brother sees it. She's crazy enough that she would watch all of my videos to see if I say anything about her. My sister-in-law. She's nuts. See, I said something, but I didn't mention her name, so you don't know which one it is. I have, how many sisters-in-laws do I have? Two. I have two sisters-in-laws. The ecological perspective views people and their environment as continuously evolving. The ecological perspective is less concerned with cause and effect and more concerned with the transactions that occur between people and their environments. So sometimes you're in a bad environment. This is one of the complaints about poverty. Poverty puts you in a negative environment. So now we need to talk about ecological interactions. Interactions between you and your environment. Let's say that Let's say that they take me and they move me to Los Angeles. Los Angeles is a very crowded place. Or they send me to Chicago, and I'm starting to live in Chicago. You know, people that live in Chicago think it's the most wonderful place in the world. You can go downstairs from your apartment and get yourself a Starbucks. By golly, any time of the day. You can go out and get yourself a barbecue sandwich just by walking to the end of the corridor. If I want a barbecue sandwich, I better buy it when I go to Gallup, or I ain't gonna have a barbecue sandwich tomorrow. I have to drive 77 miles to get a barbecued sandwich. Now I can get a Starbucks. I don't drink coffee, but if I did, I could go right here and get a Starbucks. But before they built that thing, where would I have to go for coffee? Gallup again? I'm going to Gallup? Well, or Chinley. I guess Chinley probably has coffee somewhere. I don't know. I try not to go to Chinley very much. The ecological perspective. It's so brown, isn't it?
You should be there during a brownout.
It's like dirt everywhere. There's no trees, there's nothing green. The trees are brown.
That's your problem?
It's brown. Where I live, it's green. I'm having ecological problems, obviously. I have to readjust my brain to living in this environment. Not the easiest thing in the world. Well, I'll talk about that in just a second. Ecological perspective was derived from the concepts of biological ecology. This structure enables practitioners and clients to think about the reciprocal relationship between people and their environment. When I was in the military, of course, the military is a different ecology as well. You're around all of these individuals. Most of these individuals are kind of violent to some extent, depending on who you're running around with. So you've got to be careful as to what you say and what you do. This is a different ecology. You're living right next to these guys. It's like you're roommates with everybody in your unit. That's a different ecology. Then they send you someplace strange like Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam or Bosnia or wherever the hell they want to send you. Of course, now you're in a new environment again. And now you have to figure out what the hell's going on in that environment, Iraq, Afghanistan. Okay. And the people dress funny. And they don't like you very much because you're their enemy. Or sometimes they just don't like you because they're not supposed to like you. Because you're a different religion than they are. They're Muslim and you're not. You keep trying to flirt with their women, and they don't want you flirting with their women. They don't want you to even talk to them. You know, that's a big problem with soldiers.
That's like that in Okinawa.
Oh, yeah. Oh, geez, Japan. Yeah. The Americans in anything that has to do with Japan. We think that they're cute. They're such cute little guys. Japanese women. And so you want to flirt with them. And it seems like they're flirting with you, but they're just trying to speak English to you. That's all that's going on. They don't really want to, marry you, be taken away to someplace else, not most of them. So a lot of times we go to really crowded places. As far as I'm concerned, where I live in Iowa, my closest neighbor is a half mile down the road. I have a neighbor to one going that way, it's half mile down the road. I mean, that's as close as we get. I live right next door to Ed. Actually, I live in a duplex, and Ed Curtis is my neighbor. And so we live in the same house together, kind of. He's right, he doesn't make any noise. I don't know what he does over there. Maybe he crawls into his coffin every night. And he doesn't watch television. His son doesn't play basketball anymore. I don't know what's going on over there. And on the other side is Ken Losey, the science teacher. And his new wife, he's got a new wife and a new baby. And his mother-in-law, which I haven't seen his mother-in-law yet. But, we're right next to each other. So if I go outside, I can go outside and urinate in my front yard like I can back in Iowa. In Iowa, I don't have a neighbor within a half a mile of me. Not only that, but I've got like 10-foot corn plants growing all over the place. place. So I can do whatever the hell I want to do. I can run around naked if I want, nobody sees me. But not here. I can't even take off my shirt here. Somebody said, oh, Navajos don't take off their shirt. Really? Oh, shit, what am I gonna do? Anyway, ecology. So this has to do with you and dealing with your environment. And sometimes you're not dealing very well with your environment. You're in the wrong place. You're a rural person, you need to live in the city. Or you're a city person and you're living in a rural environment and it's driving you insane. There's just not enough stimulation, you need more stimulation. Or you're used to buying food and you live in Salee, and so you have to drive all the way to Chinle just to find a hamburger. And not a very good hamburger either. If you want a good hamburger, you have to go all the way to Gallup for a good hamburger. Or somebody knows of a good hamburger in Chinle.
Oh, Junction,
Where?
Junction.
No.
The Junction?
Thunderbird.
The Thunderbird has a good hamburger.
Really good hamburgers.
Burger King.
No.
Don't go to Denny's, that's for sure, the meat looks funky.
I went to Denny's, I was in the service, and we were driving from Lubbock, Texas to Indiana. And we stopped in Wichita Falls at Denny's. And this is like 2 o'clock in the morning. And my daughter ordered chili spaghetti. And they brought the spaghetti out, and it was in this great big plate. Of course, she's only like 4 years old, and they give her a plate that weighs about 5 pounds. And it's got all of this sauce on top, and it's got all of these, I mean, the noodles must have been this big around. It was like snakes. Okay, so they had spaghetti snakes, but they hadn't drained the spaghetti. So it was a plate of water on the bottom and spaghetti in between, and then it had sauce on top. And the sauce was kind of like congealed. It wasn't, they didn't put it on there hot. Are you getting the picture? Okay, does it sound good? It's like Jell-O on top of, chili Jell-O on top of these worms. They were the size of my finger. And my daughter wouldn't eat it. And I said, you know, this is, and I barely had any money. I was only a 2-striper. I didn't have any money. This is during Vietnam when we weren't being paid anything. I didn't have hardly any money, and I really needed to feed my kids, and they just fed me this Jell-O topped spaghetti snake thing with water underneath. And I said, this isn't right. Look at the spaghetti. And they just hit the fan. I mean, those guys said, whoa, what do you expect? You military guys are always coming in. Shepherd Air Force Base is in Wichita Falls. So he read me the riot act. And I'm pissed off because my daughter's crying and my son's sitting there eating his food like going, oh, I got some good food. And he's just scarfing it down because he's afraid his sister's going to steal some of his food. Anyway, I don't go to Denny's. I haven't been to Denny's since. And it's because they screwed me in Wichita Falls in 1973, okay? In 1973, Denny's messed me over and I'm not going back. And I haven't been back since. Has that ever happened to you? Going to Denny's?
Yes, with Chili's,
Chili's?
yes, in Farmington.
Oh, yeah.
Fridays, I've had problems.
2018.
Anyway, okay. Enough stories, okay, I'm not gonna tell you any more sad stories. Yeah, and I didn't get my money back. And I was driving this car that the alignment was off, so it kind of drove down the road sideways. And I had to drive all the way to Indiana in that horrible car. Its maximum speed was like 55 miles an hour, so I couldn't, speed limit was 55. Anyway, that's as fast as I could go. And it kind of rattled a little bit, driving sideways down the road. Perfect restaurant. Ecological perspective has 3 important components. The person-environment fit. Person-environment fit refers to how well a person's needs, goals, and rights mesh with the social and physical environment that you're living in. And then this is one of the things we look at with freshmen. coming into a new college environment. We look at the person-environment fit. When I started college back in 1967, oh my God, that was such a long time ago. In 1967, we had a guy from Malta at our college. I don't know if you know what Malta is. It's an island in the Mediterranean Sea. It's like the coolest place in the world. It's like all rock songs come from Malta. It was just the coolest place. This is in 1967, right after the British invasion. Well, it belongs to England. So there were a lot of English people. All the rich English people go there because it's an island. It's got all this beach front. I know it's all beach. So all the people living on Malta are very, very wealthy. Well, this kid came from Malta to Crawfordsville, Indiana, the hickiest town in the United States. And he's the coolest guy in the world. He's got long hair, he wears all the fancy rock clothes that everybody was wearing in 1967. And he just didn't fit in. He didn't fit in with us. We didn't fit in with him. The environment certainly didn't fit in because he was used to going out to nightclubs every night. Well, there were no nightclubs in the hickiest town in the United States. So he just didn't fit. And he left before the semester was over with. That and the fact he couldn't read, that had something to do with it as well. I lived in Martindale Hall, and his last name was Martindale, and it was because his grandfather was the guy that gave the money for the hall. Okay, anyway, he was a wealthy kid. Why, I don't know why the hell he ever went to our college. From Malta, I mean, who would do that? But he dropped out after a year, or before the first semester was over with. Adaptations are the processes that people use to sustain or increase the level of fit between themselves and the environment. So we try to adapt to our environment, and that's what I'm trying to do here, where I've told you how green it is up there, how humid it is up there. One of the things that has happened since I came back is that I've been dehydrated ever since I got back. In Iowa, all you have to do is breathe and you get moisture. So you don't have to drink nearly as much up there as you do down here. But here, of course, it's dry, and you guys haven't had rain for, I don't know, a couple of weeks now. But up there, it's nice and humid. We got corn growing around us, and it puts off moisture. I mean, you've got trees, and all those trees have moisture. The humidity's in the 70s, your humidity's in single digits because it's so dry down here. So I've had to adapt to drinking. I have to drink more here than I did up there. And I need to drink water. Up there I can drink pop because I don't drink that much. I don't need to. But down here, of course, I need to drink more water. So I need to adapt to the environment. What else happened? Exercise. When I first came down here, I was getting chubby because I wasn't exercising. In Iowa, I had a treadmill in my basement. I used to run every morning. But here I don't have a treadmill, so what do? Well, you can run outside as long as, you can run outside. And that's what I started doing. I wasn't used to running outside, and now I'm running outside. I'm trying to adapt to my environment. Trying to adapt, but the hardest thing to adapt to is having people come to my house all the time. In Iowa, they can't even find my house. I mean, I'm in the middle of a cornfield, so nobody knows where I live. But here, I've got like 2 or 3 people come to my house every night doing this, trying to sell me wood or trying to sell me necklaces or whatever. I don't need necklaces, my wife doesn't wear them, so I don't know. Anyway, I have a lot of people knocking on my door. That's a little unnerving. I got Ed living next door, Ken's on the other side. I've got Margaret and Debbie Robinson walk past my house every night with their dogs. Of course, my dogs are crazy. So I need to adapt, and it's not so easy. So that's 2 of the 3 components that we were talking about: person, environment, fit. You need to adapt to your environment, and the last is life stressors, are issues that exceed the resources of an individual to deal with dealing with these, and these are the life stressors. So we all have life stressors. Here is a little bit more extreme for me than it is anyplace else. In Iowa, I've got my wife, of course. Here, if I want to eat, I have to make my own damn food. I have to cook. Okay. But last night, Marius' wife sent over some lasagna. I had some really good lasagna last night. Anyway, what else? I'm lonely because my wife's not there. I'm lonely because I'm not around my grandson. I've got my 2 dogs, but dogs and people are different. They are different. So these are my life stressors. Not only that, but I came to work here. When I came here, I was teaching 4 classes, and now I'm teaching 8 classes because so many people quit. Yes, sir.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
A little personal maybe, but relates to this a little bit.
Doesn't have to do with sex, does it?
No, no. Do you feel, or do you go through any like anxiety or any type of emotion for being below Ghana, like
No.
in an area where there's so many Navajos?
No. I don't, I'm sorry. If I were new to Indian country, then probably I would. But since I've lived in Indian country for 15 or 20 years.
What
doesn't
about
bother-
when you first came?
You guys are different, well, I told you this, you guys are different than the people up north. They're a little bit more accepting, a little bit more embracing. Yeah, that was a little off-putting, but no, it doesn't bother me. I'm not scared. You guys don't scare me, I'm sorry. But Indians do scare people. I mean, it's weird. I don't know why. I mean, you guys are the nicest people in the world. Yes, ma'am?
Did you live near the Winnebago and the Omaha tribe?
No, no. Winnebago and Omaha. Actually, when I lived in Nebraska, they were just up north. They were just north of us. So, yeah. I was living not in Bellevue. I was living in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, working in Omaha at the hospital. And the guys from up north would come down from time to time, and we'd take care of them. Winnebago and Omaha. Yeah.
So-
Nice people. They own a casino up there. I don't know if you know that.
We usually stay up there every year.
Oh, the Winnebago Casino?
No, the Iowa and the borderline between Nebraska and Iowa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the Missouri River.
Yeah, we stay at that.
Yeah, we lived on the Missouri River, yeah, so I'm used to being around people who claim Indian ancestry, not Elizabeth Warren, of course. I mean, I lived in Oklahoma for 4 years, I lived in Nebraska for 7 years, lived in Montana for 10 years, so, no, you guys don't scare me. And I'm not anxious because I've been living around you guys, doesn't bother me. I find, and here's the weird part, when I go home to Iowa, it's the white people that drive me nuts, because I'm used to being around nice native people. And white people just kind of ignore you, and, you know, they don't treat you as nice.
I asked the question because I was just thinking what other stuff that you were talking about. It's a big reason why a lot of Navajos used to drop out of college. All of the stuff that you were talking about right up to this point. And I just wondered if it was the same for other people coming here.
Actually, we see the same thing at all the tribal colleges. When we send them off to university, when we send them to the University of Montana, or you guys ASU or AU, one of the things we see is that they have cultural problems.
Culture shock. Yeah.
Culture shock, exactly. So they're used to being around people that want them to succeed. But a lot of times, when they're in an academic environment like that, you know, that population doesn't care about you. They don't care about each other, let alone caring about making sure that you guys succeed. So that can be a really serious problem. Up in Montana, we saw this on an almost continuous basis. We sent more people to, fewer people were successful going to university than dropped out of school. So if we sent them to university, it was like 10% would stay there and succeed, and 90% would come back. And sometimes it was because their parents wanted them, they couldn't live without them, that kind of thing.
It
Yeah,
makes
you're the one-
sense, because the other parallel that I drew from that too is like soldiers getting out of the military.
Right.
They have that culture shock coming back into civilian life, where
Oh, yeah.
nobody cares about them either.
No.
They come from a close team to
Exactly.
being anonymous in it.
Where you got the first sergeant making sure that you
Yeah.
all your clothes are folded correctly. And now all of a sudden, nobody cares if you wear clothes. Or if you live or die. I mean, but the military does care because, you're money to them. You're cannon fodder. They trained you, they spend all that money training you, now they want you to survive so that they can get all their money out of it.
Get their money's worth.
I know.
I really would like to bring my dad into your classes. I would like to
Is he
see.
military?
Yeah,
Oh.
he says the same thing you guys are saying.
Well, he's absolutely correct. Your dad's really smart. So there are life stressors, and there's a lot of life stressors here for me. But it's not what, it is for another person that's never been in this kind of an environment before. It's just so different for them. The culture shock is massive. And there was a degree of culture shock, but most of it had to do with me being used to being around other Indians, and you guys are different than they are, and I didn't really quite understand that. Omaha and Winnebago, they're both Siouan. Yeah, they speak the Siouan language. Yeah, nice people, really nice people.
Is age a factor in all of this stuff that you're talking about?
Well, I've lived all over the world, and I've had to get along with, Asians and Egyptians and Europeans and everybody. I've lived in black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods. So I'm used to being around people, I'm used to not being the same as everybody else. So that may be the fact that I'm older, that I'm 70 years old, and I'm more adapted now than I was before. I've got brothers that can't leave home, they can't leave Indiana, because, people from Ohio act differently than people from Indiana. But I've lived all over the I've lived in 17 different states. So I'm used to people being different. Yes, ma'am?
Are you really 70?
Yeah, I'm 70 years old. No, I'm 69, I'll be 70 in October.
69.9.
69, 11 months and, okay. No, I'll be 70 in October.
You'll be 70 again?
I wish I was 68 again. I was so young when I was 68. I wish I was 65. Okay, we're talking about ecological perspective. Behaviors are not seen as dysfunctional or maladaptive. You have to adapt to your environment. So one of the aspects of ecological perspective is that we are looking at people adapting to their environment. And sometimes they adapt in a negative way. So they would look at drug abuse as a form of adaptation. They are trying to adapt to that environment. And the only way to do that is drugs. Now the interesting thing about the ecological perspective is, how about suicide? Is that a form of an adaptation? Is that an acceptable behavior? Well, usually killing yourself is not, but in this case, sometimes that's it. Sometimes that is an adaptation that has to take place. Instead, behavior is viewed as adaptations to improve the fit between the individual and the environment. So no matter what you do, whether it's being passive-aggressive to get along with Sarah, or it's offing myself because I can't stand the loneliness anymore, that is a form of adaptation, okay? And according to the ecological perspective, that is acceptable behavior. Now, the suicide is extreme, but the passive-aggressive behavior, that's very logical. How do you get along with an insane boss? You adapt in one way or the other, and maybe you spend a lot more time playing video games. It's possible you're doing something in order just to get along. Okay. And video games are a form of adaptation. How do I get along in this environment? This is the most boring place I've ever been. This is the most boring place that I've ever been. How am I going to entertain myself? Well, maybe I can play video games on my telephone. My grandson plays video games on my wife's telephone. He erased all of her apps so that he could put more games on her telephone. And she'll just hand him the telephone and say, here, entertain yourself. And he got rid of all of her apps. I know, my poor wife. I think that's funny. I shouldn't think that's funny. You can't do that with my phone because there's nothing on my phone. Okay, I don't know how it works. I can't get text messages. There's something wrong with mine. Or I can and I don't know how to do it, okay? Okay, so that's the ecological perspective. Sometimes you have to look at a client and try to determine if their environment is, if they are able to function in their environment. And sometimes you can't. It's just the way it works. We used to see this in the military all the time. When you're in basic training, how many guys came into basic training and had to drop out before they finished? A lot, exactly. And sometimes it's because they just couldn't handle, yeah, it's a totally different environment. I mean, the toughest guy, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna kill all the whoever's.
Oh, my mama.
And before you're done with basic training, the first time they fire the rifle, the first time, well, in my case it was the M16, but the first time they fire their weapon, it's just too loud for them. They're too nervous, and they're gone. I had a guy that in our basic training unit, and we were walking through the line and getting our fingers stuck so they could type our blood and put it on our dog tags, okay? And so we got our fingers out, and of course we're standing in our underwear. They always have you stripped down to practically nothing. And we're getting our fingers stuck, and they stuck my finger, and they bled my finger, and they got my blood type. And the guy was right behind me, a redhead, exactly. He was a redhead, and he didn't understand what was going on. He didn't realize people were going to stick him with not a needle, but it was a lancet. And they stuck his finger, and he was so high-strung that he jumped backwards, and it was just like this. He jumped backwards, and he slammed the back of his head into the wall and knocked himself out. They boarded him out of the service because he was so high-strung. That was the last time we saw him, when he was getting his fingers stuck. He was in the Air Force for 3 days. But he was too high-strung. Okay, so sometimes you just don't fit in the environment. We had another guy that had leg cramps. The reason he had leg cramps was because of the food, which was, I thought it was great food, but he didn't like the food, and it had too much sodium in it, and he would have leg cramps every night. They boarded him out of the service as well, because he got leg cramps from the high sodium content of the food that we ate. Of course, you had to take in salt because we did our basic training down in San Antonio, Texas, in the fall, and it was really dry and hot down there. So you needed salt. You needed to take in a lot of salt, and he couldn't handle it. He couldn't handle the salt that was in our food, in the food. So we had to board him out. They boarded him out. I didn't have anything to do with it. Okay, so that's the ecological perspective. Strength perspective. The strength perspective views all people as having strengths. We all have our strengths and our weaknesses, but the strength perspective, of course, focuses on your strength. It focuses on assets that clients have developed throughout their lives, means of adaptation. These tend to be strengths. You can get along with it, practically anybody. You know how to live in a negative environment. All of these things are strengths that you potentially have. A strength is defined as any psychological process that enables a person to think and to act in order to benefit himself or herself in society. The only way I could get along with Sarah was to become more passive-aggressive. That was a strength. My passive-aggressive behavior was a strength, because otherwise I argued with her. Otherwise we were at loggerheads, and nothing got done. And it would bother her in her teaching. It would bother me in my teaching. So in order for us to teach at our optimum level, I had to be more passive-aggressive so that she could be more dominant. She felt the need to be more dominant, and I was okay with that. oh geez, how can you get along with with a woman that has to be dominant? Well, it was easy for me because I'd worked in medicine for 30 years, and I always had nurses that were in charge, or because I had a mother that was a nurse, awesome lady. So it didn't bother me a whole lot. Strengths are often developed when people struggle with difficulties, traumas, oppression, disappointments, and adversity. And so we actually develop all of these different strengths in order just to get along in our environment, whatever the environment is. We develop strengths. We develop adaptations, and these become our strengths. Everyone has the capacity to develop new resources, to make positive changes, and to use his or her competencies to solve our problems. I've been dealing with two young gentlemen who were having problems when they were in high school. They were cool, C-O-O-L, not K-O-O, okay. They were really cool, and since they were cool, of course, they did what everybody else did in order to get along. And what was everybody else doing? Well, everybody else was drinking. So they were cool, so they drank too. Okay. So at some point you have to decide, well, you know, getting drunk every Friday night and staying drunk on Saturday and then Sunday is probably not the most adaptive thing I can possibly do. Maybe I need to be different than, you know, the cool people. Maybe being cool is not smart. And of course, they were starting to get into trouble. They were doing dumb things. They had DUIs, and they couldn't drive anymore because somebody had lifted their license since they had done it a couple times. Okay, so they needed to change their lives. They needed something to happen. They needed a positive change. They needed to start moving in a positive direction. Alcohol is kind of like getting stuck in the mud and then your tires just keep spinning. Drugs are the same way. You're just spinning your wheels. You're not maturing. And we talked about this before. Who was I talking to? Was it in this class? If you start drinking when you're 15 years old, your brain stops maturing at 15. It was in here? Okay. That's something so literally you're spinning your wheels. Your brain is not getting any smarter, and as a matter of fact, you're doing damage to it because alcohol destroys brain cells. So you're killing your brain at the same time you're not getting any older. You're not acting any older because you're drinking alcohol. So what we needed to do, these individuals needed to stop being cool. They needed to stop drinking on the weekends. So how in the world do you change that? Well, in this case, they were living someplace else, and we needed to take them out of that negative environment. And they needed to start moving in a positive direction. So we got them enrolled in school. Now they're here. In order that they don't know the bootleggers around here, so they don't know where to find the booze. That's a good thing. Okay. They're not around in the same environment. They're not around their friends. They get drunk every weekend, so that's a positive thing. They're not around these idiots. And they've stopped drinking, and they've stopped drinking and driving. Well, they can't drive because they don't have driver's licenses because they lost their driver's license. Okay, so now suddenly this has become a strength. Going to school is a strength for them. It's a positive direction for them. They have changed their lifestyle, or at least they've changed their lifestyle for right now. But we have to keep an eye on these individuals to make sure that they don't slip back into their old habits. Start drinking here, go home and on the weekends to be with their girlfriends, you know, the girlfriends. There's nothing worse than girlfriends if you're a guy, because girlfriends talk you into being cool. Girls only like you if you're cool, and was being cool for them, getting drunk. You guys getting all this, writing all this down? Being cool means getting drunk, okay. And this has changed over time. It has changed a ton. When I was in school, it was completely different. And back in the 60s and 70s, that things were very, very much different. And now, of course, this is what you have to do in order to be acceptable in select environments. You believe that? Okay, so you have to understand how high school kids work. You have to understand how 20-year-olds work. And things do change over time. Video games are different. I mean, they didn't have video games. I can remember the first video game My kids played, it was Pong, that strange game where you're playing tennis and the ball moves so slowly to the other side.
Atari.
And you have to, yeah, it's Atari, and you have to move that thing down so that the ball hits it and it bounces back. But it bounces back so slow. It's like going to sleep, okay? Strength perspective invites clients to discover, think about and figure out how to use their strengths. This is different from traditional counseling because they tend to identify deficits, weaknesses, and problems. One of the things that they're going to want you to do is to diagnose individuals, but if you're dealing with the strength perspective, you're identifying their strengths and you're trying to accentuate those strengths. And you're not saying, well, you've got borderline personality disorder, you've got this problem. You're not identifying their weaknesses, you're identifying their strengths. So it makes it a little bit different. This is the social work perspective. The social work perspective does not diagnose. If you're a counseling social worker, a lot of times you will not diagnose your clients. A lot of times you'll just identify their strengths and try to accentuate those strengths. Anyway, okay, so we're not looking for problems, deficits, or weaknesses. We're looking for strengths. When working with individuals, families, groups, or organizations, the practitioner looks for their strengths, identifies their resources, and invites them to focus on possibilities for the future. And this is what we did with these two young gentlemen. We tried to talk them into accentuating their positive and eliminating the negative. They don't have to be cool anymore. The sites where they were living, Saley cool ain't the same as the cool where they were living. Okay, so that's what we did. We invited them not to act the way they were acting before, and to be more positive about their life. Yes, sir.
So I guess from a clinician's standpoint, you have a little bit of distance perspective, so it's easy to identify those things.
Right.
How do you get your patient to become self-aware of these things?
Well, you get him to tell you his story. That's the first thing you do.
Oh, so they hear it themselves?
Well, they tell you their story, and then you accentuate, well, you know, when you were, you could have beat that person up, but instead you talk to them, and that's a strength, the fact that you didn't lose your temper. Now, we've identified a strength. So in the story, we're picking out all these instances where they demonstrated
So you
strength.
can do a little compare and contrast with them.
Exactly.
With the options that they have and the
Exactly.
choices they do.
Right. They may have thought, geez, I'm such a chicken shit because I didn't punch the guy in the nose. But the reality is they didn't lose their temper. And they were seeing it as a weakness, but you're identifying it as a strength. And a lot of times this is the way the world works. You know, your culture tells you one thing and the reality may be something different.
So you help them see the perspective from another view.
Another view, exactly, exactly. So you're picking little pieces of their story out, and you're re-identifying it as a strength. It works, it really does work. I don't know if you know it or not, but people like to be complimented. They like you to say nice things to them. Okay, so if you're a diagnosing psychologist and you're identifying their weaknesses and their problems and their deficits, that's pretty depressing, as you can imagine. But if you're a psychologist that looks at strengths and you're identifying their strengths, it makes them feel good. It makes them feel like they have something that they didn't realize they had before. You're re-identifying their perspective. You're changing their perspective to see things a little bit differently. And this is real positive because you're saying nice things to them, whereas somebody else has told them, you know, that you're weak.
Or they tell themselves.
Or they've been telling themselves all their lives, exactly, exactly. Resilience is the ability to survive and thrive in the face of overwhelming life challenges. That's what resilience is. I did my dissertation on resilience among American Indians, but not you guys, of course. I wasn't here, I was up north in Montana. So I was identifying their resilience. But the reason I wanted to identify their resilience was because I was going to say, look, you guys have all this resilience, now stop killing yourself. That's what I wanted to say. I wanted to identify a strength so that they would it would give them a positive feeling about themselves. That's what I was trying to do. So that's why I did the research on resilience.
So it's mostly suicide, is that what it was? Like,
It was one of the techniques that we could use to combat suicide. I mean, suicide is tough. I mean, it's really hard, because if I've got a whole room full of people that want to kill themselves, everybody's reason is different. So it's really hard to identify, you know, I've got to talk to Mose about this, and I got to talk to you about something else, and Scott about something else. You know, everybody's reason for wanting to hurt themselves is completely different. So if I can identify a single strength that I can use to convince people that that they have the capability of surviving whatever the trauma is that you think that you need to kill yourself over. If I can identify that one strength, then potentially it will make them think twice about killing themselves. And a lot of times with suicide, if you can make them smile one time, if you can make them think a positive thought while you're talking to them, I don't know if you've ever done this, talked to people when they were wanting to commit suicide, but all you need to do is change their mindset a little bit, you can keep them from killing themselves. But the trick is for them to call you on the phone and to talk to you. And of course, they're talking about, oh, you know, my life is shit. You know,
yeah,
my wife left, my dog died, my car broke down. You know,
yeah.
I'm just going to kill myself. And then you say, yeah, but, you know, they're 7 feet tall. Tall people are. That's a positive.
Your best opinion.
There you go. You run instead of walk. Okay, there's a positive thing. So with resilience, what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify their resilience. And if we can identify their resilience, a lot of times it'll give them a positive idea about who they are. Now, I wanted to do this with American Indians. And the reason I wanted to do this with American Indians is because people tried to talk me into doing research about child abuse. They wanted they wanted me to do research about sexual molestation, about drug addiction, about alcoholism. Just everybody was doing the same research. They were coming onto the reservation and they were identifying all the negative things about my friends. These are my friends. I know these people. I know what they've gone through. And I wanted to identify something positive about them. And so that's why I did my research on resilience. I mean, this was going on, I was trying to decide what to do my research on for a couple of years. And everybody would come to me and say, well, you need to do it on alcoholism because we have an alcoholism rate of 80%, you know. And I'm thinking, yeah, but if I identify something negative about you, you know, what positive is going to come out of that? And of course, the positive that they were thinking is we'll get more funding for our alcohol abuse program. And I was thinking, I want to save people's lives, not identify their ugliness, you know. And this is one of the problems we have in Indian country, is that people keep identifying all your problems and nobody looks at any of the positive things about you. And so I identified culture and I identified resilience. So I was trying to identify positive things.
Are IRBs aware of that?
Probably not. When somebody has a study, they look to see if that's important. And of course, their idea of important is fixing something. So, no, they're not. That's part of the problem. Go ahead.
I was going to ask you, what were their resilient points and up north, like what made them strong? What did you identify?
Interesting question, because I had 5 dependent variables. My 5 dependent variables had to do with age. Are older people more resilient than younger people? Education, are more educated people more resilient than less educated people? Gender, are women more resilient than men? Culture, does culture make a difference as far as resilience is concerned? And last but not least was trauma. The more trauma you have, are you less resilient? Okay. And what I identified was that age didn't make a difference, education didn't make a difference, gender didn't make a difference, but the other two did make a difference. Now this was really kind of curious. The one thing that was significant was culture. The stronger their culture, the more resilient they were. So what I suggested was that the federal government support cultural practices, you know, all the things that they haven't been doing for the last 250 years, or 300 years, or whatever. That's what I suggested that they do. So I told them that culture was the most important thing as far as resilience was concerned. The other thing had to do with trauma. If we look at all the populations around the world and we look at trauma, the more trauma you've been through, the less resilient you are. Now here's the bizarre part. On the reservation in Indian country, the more trauma you have suffered, the more resilient you are. And this is the only population that we see that in. It's not in the black population, not in the Hispanic population, it's not. They did the same research in Germany, that's not what they found. They did it in Africa, that's not what they found. But on Indian reservations, and we've done 3 different studies and found exactly the same thing. I was up north in Montana, they did one on the Hopi reservation, and they found exactly the same thing. No matter how much trauma this individual had been through, their resilience level didn't change. And the other one was done on the Navajo reservation.
Isn't that the same as the ACEs study, where you do suffer trauma, but as, like, if it happens to you as a child, you learn how to protect yourself by being quiet, or you learn
Sure,
how to...
you adapt.
Yeah.
Of course.
But then you're stuck in that childhood phase of protecting yourself in the way
Right.
that you have
Well, that's
as
Freud.
an adult, but you have to go through counseling to get out of that, right?
Well, potentially, unless you find a way to adapt your adaptation to your adult life. And that happens, I mean, that has to do with adaptation as well. So this is how I protect myself, now that I don't need to protect myself from my father who's dead. You know, now I can adapt this to the rest of my life. And it doesn't have to be negative. Okay,
Right.
okay.
I'm really interested in that.
I know, it's
study.
fascinating,
It is.
isn't it? Anyway, okay, so resilience was really important to me, and I wanted to say something positive about my friends. And the reason I did was because I was working at Fort Belknap College, and a lot of the people that worked there were recovered alcoholics. My best friend, I've got pictures of him all over my office. Up there was this Korean War veteran who was the worst son of a bitch you can possibly imagine until he stopped drinking. He had 3 wives, he had 6 kids, didn't take care of anybody until he stopped drinking, of course. And then, and now he's a leader in his tribe. He dances. He didn't dance before. He was a cowboy before. He used to go to cowboy bars and, you know, beat everybody up, you know, that kind of a situation. But as soon as he stopped drinking, he became a model citizen. How can you do that? I mean, if you have all these if you have all these deficits, he had all these ex-wives and children that he wasn't taking care of, how in the world do you do that? Well, you do that because you're resilient, and that's what I wanted to show. The guy that was the vice president of the college had been this god-awful rodeo drug addict who was able to stop using drugs, and once he did, he became a good husband, he became a good father, and he became a functional member of the tribe, to the extent that he'd been the tribal chairman at one juncture in his life. So, I mean, I saw all this resilience, and I thought that this is what I needed to accentuate, not the fact that they had been alcoholics once upon a time, but the fact that they were able to recover from all this negative stuff.
And they have so much wisdom from that experience.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And of course, I'd been through hardly anything, so, you know.
How can you relate to someone?
Yeah, exactly. Or as somebody from off the reservation, how can I relate to them?
Mhm.
And I thought that accentuating their positive things about them was more important than identifying their deficits. Okay, so that's resilience. Resilience is a dynamic process that is the outcome of positive adaptations in the face of adversity, stress, or risk. We all go through stuff. I almost said shit. We all go through things. We all go through stuff, and we all survive, and potentially we survive. The red-headed guy that was boarded out of the service, the guy that had the leg cramps, and we had to get rid of him because he couldn't function in the military. You know, they went through things that they weren't able to adapt, but the rest of us were. One of the hardest things to adapt to when I was in the military was the fact that this was 1971. In 1971, men wore their hair very, very long. I mean, very, very long, like longer than women do today. I mean, your hair's short, you would be considered a not cool guy. Okay. But back then, people had like hair down to their waist and all kinds of crazy stuff. So the hardest part was, when we went into the service, they shaved our heads. I know, that was the worst part back then, of course, because everybody had long hair. So we couldn't go downtown because everybody knew we were military. And they would, I don't know, do stuff. Beat us up and stuff. And this is during Vietnam War, and that wasn't a very popular war. So the people in the military at that time, of course, were suffering a lot more because the hairstyles, the clothing styles, were completely different than people that are in the military. And people in the military, if you go to the BX and you buy clothes, don't ever buy clothes at the BX because they were in style 5 years ago when they ordered the damn things. And they just came in, of course. So, and they always wear black socks. Military people always wear black socks. Usually their knee socks, they come all the way up to their, and of course he's wearing black socks. And Scott's got black socks. Yeah. Because they don't sell white socks because you can't wear white socks when you're in the military. So you have to wear the black socks. Do you see what I'm talking about? This is horrible.
So this is, you're talking about like emotional flexibility,
Right.
being able to.
Adaptation, exactly. Exactly. Resilience is not a fixed personality trait or an inborn characteristic. A lot of times people are resilient in a lot of different aspects, but not resilient in this one. So at work, I'm fine. As soon as I go home, my wife beats me up. So what's that all about? So I'm resilient in every other aspect of my life, but in one aspect of my life, I may not be resilient. I can't handle it. While I was home, my wife, no, it was when I was here. My wife came down, she drove my other car, I've got 2 cars. She drove my second car, and when she got here, she said, you need to quit. She's trying to get me to quit. She said, you need to quit. They're treating you, they're not paying you enough money, and you're being a sap about it. She called me a sap. My wife called me a sap. Now that may not mean a whole lot to you guys, but I've been watching old movies for a really, really long time. And if somebody calls you a sap, you have to get into a fist fight with them because that's about the worst thing you can be called. It means that you're being stupid, but beyond stupid, I mean, you're doing stupid things. That's what sap means. And she called me a sap. She tried to get me to quit. I didn't, okay? Now, maybe I should have. Maybe we'll get a divorce because of it. Not because I care. I mean, I've been called lots of different things. Most of them start with F. Anyway, I'm fairly resilient about these kinds of things. I talked to her last night. My wife has 2 voices. My wife was a colonel in the Air Force. And this is active duty Air Force. She was in for 24 years. So my wife has 2 voices. Usually when she talks to me, it's her sweet voice. It's not her military voice. Last night I was talking to her on the phone and she used her military voice the whole time. Deep, it's kind of deep. She says things, she makes points by saying them, very distinctly. And that's the way she talked to me last night, which was kind of weird. So I don't know. If she starts treating me like the enlisted person that I actually am, then maybe things aren't going to go as well as they did before. So we'll see, I'm gonna go home in October. I'm gonna visit her in October and I'll see if she makes me stand at attention. You know. Lock those knees. Ma'am, yes, ma'am. Okay, so no one is either vulnerable or resilient all the time. So sometimes you can be the most resilient person in the world, all of a sudden a tornado hits, or you have an earthquake and your house falls down, or you're in a hurricane, and you just can't handle it. You know. So you're resilient all the time except, you know, this natural disaster makes
Great until you need to be great.
Exactly. When I was in college, I was a pretty tough guy, ran track, I passed all my classes, I shook my finger at my professors, but then I'd go home and my wife, and you know, I turned into a little bunny rabbit. You know, my wife would start screaming at me and whatnot. So I was resilient as far as everybody else was concerned. And not only that, but I told you the story of what happened when I was having an argument with my wife. It was so stressful for me that I didn't handle it very well. Okay. And I had a reaction. My kidneys shut down. Because it wasn't because of the track meet, it wasn't because of school, it was because I had had an argument with my wife all weekend. And that was my first one. She's not there anymore.
Stress?
Oh, it's extremely stressful. She's gonna leave me, take my baby away. No, see, it even makes me cry. I kept my kids, okay? She left and I kept my kids and everything turned out okay. Wow. But I say negative things about her. You'll hear all my stories about my first book. She was physically abusive. She used to hit me with baseball bats. She dumped hot water on me. She stabbed me a couple of times. Resilience is learned behaviors, and I didn't handle it very well. I didn't know what to do with it, you know. She's this abusive person, and I can handle myself with guys or with women that aren't my wife, but here's this little tiny 4'11" lady that weighs all of 85 pounds, and she's wailing away on me, and there's nothing I can do about it. For one thing, I was afraid if I lifted my hand to her, I'd break her, because she's so tiny. So she used to just hit me all the time. Resilience is learned behaviors and patterns of adaptation. Resilience depends on the availability of protective factors that you have. So a lot of us are really strong almost all the time, but there may be something that we can't handle. So there you go. So we may be resilient in most circumstances, but we can't handle select things. It's easy for me to tell people, well, just say no to drugs. That's what Lady Bird told us to do. But a lot of people can't do that. They just can't say no to drugs. As soon as they see it, smell it, see their friends, they have to do it, you know, and they're just not resilient in that aspect. Risk factors are any influencing factors that can bring or predict negative outcomes on the functioning and overall development of the individual. They can include biological influences, your adaptations, how your body is reacting to the negative, to the risk factors, individual influences, as with my wife, my first wife, and potentially my current wife. So we'll see what happens. The Colonel talked to me last night, so I'm not sure what's happening.
The stuff you're talking about, I think it sounds like it would work really well with like adults who are a little more self-aware.
Exactly.
How do you draw that out of like a younger population, like kids who don't really have that vocabulary,
Right.
or can express themselves?
You got to get them to talk. The trick to counseling is not you telling them the right answer. It's them telling you their story, and then you picking little pieces out of their story. So when you're doing counseling in here, when you all have your characters and you're all acting like that character, what you need to do is get that person to talk. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like this, but that's the last thing they want to do. They're sitting there and they don't want to tell their story. They're embarrassed because something negative has happened to them. So the trick is to get them to talk. I'll have counseling sessions where I won't say anything at all, except hello, and then they just sit there and talk. Geez, somebody came into my office the other day. Who was it? Oh, yeah. It was one of my colleagues. Came in and he just started jabbering. It wasn't your dad. It wasn't Wilson either. You can't shut him up, I swear. And he started talking, and I didn't say anything for the next, like, 2 hours, and we were there until 7 o'clock, and he just needed to talk. He just needed to talk, but he didn't need me to say anything, he just needed for him to say anything. He just needed to talk, so, yeah, it was interesting. I don't know, there's a trick to it. I guess you just don't say anything. When I don't talk to my wife, she hangs up. That's what happened last night. I didn't have anything to say. The apples are ripening. She's picking them up, I guess. She was in her Colonel voice, so. That's sexy. Not. I'm hoping for sexy, and I'm getting, you know. Didn't get any sexy last night. Family influences, of course.
Grace Santini.
Sometimes I just hate to talk to her. She's into the next election. There's a certain president she doesn't like. I won't tell you what it is. And she's trying to get the other party elected, and she's like working every night to get, you know, that party elected. So maybe that has to do with why she was in her colonel mode last night. As a military person, she has, especially in Iowa, where they just have National Guard, they don't have active duty personnel. She's got lots of power. I mean, and if she gets into her colonel mode, she can influence a lot of people. Maybe that's what was happening last night. Okay. It wasn't that she doesn't love me anymore, or doesn't think I'm sexy. She doesn't think I'm sexy. Protective factors or any factors, we're still talking about resilience perspective. Protective factors are any factors that can exert either direct or indirect influences to buffer the negative effects of the risk factor. Oh, he dropped his pencil. Protective factors include your strengths, your capabilities, your talents, your coping skills, your resources, and your assets, all the positive things dealing with you. And of course, if you've ever been in a situation where in a tornado or a hurricane, a lot of times you lose everything. And so you've got $5 in your pocket and you've got a pocket knife. Well, those are both assets. Those are both positive things. Your car still runs, but you can't get anywhere because the road is blocked because of the hurricane, because of the tornado. These are all positive things. Maybe you have the ability to use a chainsaw. And of course, you got all these trees that have fallen over the road, so you have the ability to get rid of those trees. Or maybe, and this is my case, I'm not very good with a chainsaw, but I'm really good with an axe. I can chop things. Now sometimes chainsaws, you can't get them everywhere, and you need somebody to chop something with an axe. So that's me. I'm the axe guy. Okay, there you go. These are all assets. These are all positive things. These are all capabilities. You guys don't understand what I'm talking about, because as far as you're concerned, all trees can be cut with a chainsaw. But up north, where we have hardwood, this is all pine. Where you have hardwood, you have branches that are going all in really strange directions. So sometimes you can't use a chainsaw on those. You have to chop them with an axe. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. Different situation. Resilience represents both a process and the outcome of component functioning. Resilience as an outcome involves interplay, it's almost time, of risk and protective factors. Resilience as an outcome represents the resultant positive functioning and competence developed when facing adversity, and that's what resilience is. You faced adversity and you've been able to survive, and that's what you need to think about. Now, as far as American Indians are concerned, this is the last thing I'm gonna say about resilience, but as far as American Indians are concerned, not just the long walk, I mean, all Indians have faced adversity with the federal government, and they have been put on reservations, and they have been able to survive from that environment. They've been sent to boarding schools, all this horrible negative things have happened to them, but they're still there, and they're still intact. And that is their resilience. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the things I wanted to say to the world, that my friends were resilient. Anyway, so you faced adversity, and that is your adversity, and it's ancestral. You have faced negative things, and you have survived. So that's what resilience is. So you guys should understand resilience better than anybody, because you're all resilient. And that's what I discovered, that my resilience scores with American Indians were higher than anybody else's resilience scores. And it's because your culture is so strong. So there you go. So keep building on your culture.